So I'd like to continue the theme of sharing insights from the Noonday Purification Retreat that we just had at the Abbey over Thanksgiving weekend. And today I thought I'd talk about purification and my experiences with purification. And when I first came to Buddhism, I had no clue about the importance of purification. I had a lot of questions about what it was and how it worked. And some of the practices in the Tibetan tradition seem pretty esoteric and disconnected from everyday life. I thought that just seeing the destructive nature of the afflictions with bare mindfulness would be enough to let them go. And I still think that this is true, but that comes at a much later stage where we have enough clarity and insight to perceive them at a much more subtle level. Whereas the gross afflictions, as they are currently, at least in my mind, they really obscure my ability to see the afflictions as something that's actually negative and to want to let it go. And when I first approached purification, I brought in the mindset of shame and guilt and punishment. And I really attribute this to my Catholic upbringing, where the way to purify, we were taught, is to feel as lousy about yourself as possible and then to beg God for forgiveness. And if you didn't admit that you were an inherently existent sinner, God would never forgive you and never let you into heaven. And as a teenager, I really strongly rebelled against these ideas. And so this defiant attitude was coming up when I started to do purification practices like confession to the 35 Buddhas. I felt that the practice was trying to, again, tell me that I was some kind of inherently flawed being and that I needed to rely on a higher power for absolution. I also felt pretty disconnected from the Vajrasattva practice when I started, but after doing a 3-month retreat here at the Abbey this past winter, I was really convinced of the power of purification to help the mind and to heal it. So during this most recent retreat of Noonday, I was reminded of how purification brings a great clarity to the mind so that we can see how it's working, or actually probably more how it's not working, and why this is the case, whether due to fogginess or drowsiness or confusion or just the afflictions. I also found that the fasting involved with the retreat really brought in a sense of clarity that helped me to see my thoughts as they were arising and falling, and most importantly, the virtuous or non-virtuous nature of these thoughts. So I think at first glance, purification sounds like a wonderful, blissful experience where we just throw out all of our emotional garbage and finally the love and light that's in our hearts shines out to the universe. But in my experience, there's a period of processing that happens before the transformation is complete. And this process is not always so pleasant. And thinking about this, I realized that when our body is injured and it starts to heal, there's usually some kind of pain associated with this. So why should mental healing be any different? And using the analogy of healing, I think that when we commit any non-virtuous action of body, speech, or mind, it's like inflicting a wound on our mind because we're planting a seed that will eventually result in suffering. And the pain might not come immediately, or might come sometime in the future, but that action has definitely weakened or injured the health of our mind stream. And thankfully, the Buddha taught practices that we can do to neutralize these negative karmic seeds before they ripen in suffering. And the Lamrim teaches what are traditionally known as the 4 opponent powers, or the 4 steps involved in purification. So in going through these different steps, I've come to see how there are actually some sub-steps under each of them that we have to go through in order to thoroughly purify the misdeed. And I thought I'd talk about some of those. And I also realized that I think the most important aspect to purify is the motivation, not the act itself, which, the action alone without a motivation is neither virtuous or non-virtuous, but it's really what's the mindset? What's the intent? What's the motivation behind the action? And that's really what I think is worth focusing on. So the first step involved in purification is regret or remorse. And this is where we say, I really wish I hadn't have done that. And this includes that we do some other things as well, which is admit that we actually did the action. Sometimes we don't want to admit it. Then we need to understand how that action actually harmed others or harmed ourselves, and then really let that understanding sink deeply into our hearts so that we feel it and we really get it, that this was not good. And then we take responsibility for that action instead of blaming the other person for making us act that way, or blaming society, blaming our family, whatever. And so these steps alone are not easy, but I think they're all necessary for true regret. And then the next step is call a number of things like reliance, refuge, or restoring the relationship. And I prefer restoring the relationship because it brings into focus the fact that we're connected with other beings and we've harmed this connection. And it can also include our connection with the Buddha or with our spiritual mentors, with the Dharma, with our companions, spiritual companions, and if we've happened to have broken a precept or a commitment. And so again, we're brought back to the importance of taking responsibility for our action instead of blaming the other person. And then we also recognize that we have to call on positive forces, both within it and outside of ourselves, in order to make this transformation happen. So then the third step, it's also known as the fourth step in some presentations, but the third step here is the remedial action, or fixing the situation, where we try to make amends to the people we've harmed. And again, we take personal responsibility for what we've done, for the damage to the relationship. And then we have to go and admit to the other person that we're wrong. And this is not always easy. It can take a lot of humility and courage, especially if the other person, or especially if we don't know if the other person is going to hear us out and be open to our apology. And sometimes we have to get creative in how we make amends because the person may be dead or they're long since gone from our lives. And so the teachings describe certain visualization practices you can use, such as imagining white light is flowing from the Buddha into your crown, flushing out all the negativities. And prostrations are also recommended typically as a really good way to purify. And when I first came to these practices, I asked myself, how does lying on the floor in front of a statue make you less of a jerk? I just didn't see the connection. And during this most recent retreat, I noticed a lot of energy coming up, just swirling. And I could see how the practice was really stirring up a lot of energy. And it wasn't a very comfortable process, but I knew that some blockages were being released and that the body and the mind were trying to reconfigure themselves to be more healthy and attuned energetically. So I think that the prostrations can help this process along, and also the visualizations of the light flowing through our bodies. This really helps get the energy moving and restoring the body and the mind to a more healthy operating state. And then the last power involved in purification is resolve, where we commit to never doing the action again for as long as possible. And this step, again, requires humility because we have to admit that, there's a chance that I could do this again if the situation arose. And then we have to bring in an element of wisdom where we come up with a realistic time frame for not doing the action again. Here at the Abbey, we recommend people can commit to refraining from something for as little as even 1 minute if it's something very habitual or very ingrained. And I also like the idea of resolving to do the opposite action in the future, so something positive, whereas just focusing on the negative might, it actually keeps that action in mind, whereas focusing on a positive action will get us to go in another direction. Then I hear a lot of people have asked when they come to the Abbey, how do you know when purification has worked and you've actually gotten rid of it, this negative seed? And a good answer I've heard is that your mind no longer feels burdened or preoccupied with the act. And in myself, I've noticed that a sense of self-acceptance and compassion usually arises where I fully understand why I might have done that thing at the time, but I no longer identify with that person or that motivation. And then after that, a sense of confidence arises that I can actually go forward and not really have to worry so much about doing this again. Not that I don't have to worry at all, but it doesn't consume who I think I am. And then returning to the painful processing period that I mentioned earlier, I found that it's very important to welcome in whatever emotion arises, whether it be fear or shame or grief, sadness, despair. And I talked to my mentor about this because it was coming up really strongly for me yesterday. And I want to know what's going on, and because it seemed to be completely disconnected. I wasn't experiencing any, harm in the moment. But she said that when this happens, it's because we're finally processing emotions that are connected with that transgression, but we just couldn't or didn't want to process at the time. And these difficult emotions are actually sometimes what caused us to commit the misdeed. So in looking at some of my rebellious behavior as a teenager, I could see how a lot of shame and a lot of guilt was what caused me to engage in really irresponsible behaviors. But the thing is that now we can actually rejoice that these emotions are coming up because we have a much clearer mind, we have tools, Dharma tools to work with them, and we can devote these experiences towards creating compassion for other beings and to helping us to continue along the path. So now I have no doubt that purification is absolutely essential to our practice because it allows us to let go of all of the negative habits and beliefs and identities that we carry that keep us trapped in the past, and actually free up a whole lot of energy to keep working towards our full potential. And I would encourage anybody who's watching online to do purification every day as part of your practice, and to even consider doing some kind of spiritual fasting if your health will allow it, because it provides really amazing insights into your mind, and that can really be beneficial to you and to all beings.